Hello and welcome to this edition of Building Africa's Prosperity. I'm Chris Bishop. Now this week here on CNBC Africa, we look at the big part infrastructure plays in the future of Africa and its prosperity. There is no doubt a huge infrastructure gap on the continent. Covid-19 is likely to make it worse, a lot worse. So what can be done at a time when the continent is looking to gear up for the exciting African Continental Free Trade Area? Well, I have two infrastructure experts on the line. Dr. Tawela Nyirenda-Jere, she's the head of economic integration at the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, in Pretoria, and Mapolao Mokoena is the director of infrastructure at the South African Development Community. So just to start off with you, Mama Mokoena, exactly how big is this gap we're facing? I remember the World Bank coming out with figures putting into hundreds of billions at the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago. Surely that gap is even bigger now.
Indeed, the infrastructure gap is huge, not only in SADC, but also for the whole continent. But maybe before I come to the size of the gap itself, let me indicate that indeed we do have regional frameworks which guide us in the developmental agenda of infrastructure and regional integration in the region. One key framework is the SADC Infrastructure Development Master Plan, which was adopted by SADC heads of state and government in August 2012 in Maputo, Mozambique. This was developed and adopted for the purpose of guiding the region's infrastructure development and rehabilitation program up to 2027. So our member states do, yes.
No, if I could come to you, sorry, Tawela now in Pretoria at NEPAD. Again, you know, this is a large infrastructure gap which must be of a concern to your organization, and also for the robustness and the strength of the economy in Africa. What do you think can be done about it?
So I think maybe just to circle back a little bit to the question that you asked, I think, yes, the gap is a huge one. It is in the region of, close to $100 billion, I think, at the last estimate. But I think it's also important to note that the infrastructure financing trends across the continent have been steadily growing. And if you look at the last report that was issued by the AFDB and the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, it indicated that there was increasing commitments from African governments themselves in terms of putting resources towards financing infrastructure, and also that there was a significant improvement in the way that private sector was also making commitments to infrastructure projects across the continent. So I think moving forward, I think we expect to see the same trajectory in terms of an increasing commitment to infrastructure projects, both from governments and from the private sector. But I think it's also important to note that COVID-19 obviously will have an impact in some regard. And in some instances, this impact will result in perhaps governments being a bit more inward focused or inward facing as far as infrastructure development is concerned. But at the same time, we see that even as they are allocating resources more inwardly, that there will still be that need to make the links between national infrastructure and regional infrastructure as well.
Now, if I could come back to Mapolao Mokoena, again, in this world of COVID-19, this pandemic that we're all facing, surely it's going to make the struggle for infrastructure even more important and even more difficult.
You are perfectly correct. We even before COVID, we have been encountering some challenges in as far as infrastructure deficit is concerned. For instance, insufficient energy supplies, inadequate water supply, reticulation and sanitation systems, inadequate and expensive broadband networks, and unreliable transport networks and logistics. Now, As if this was not or has not been enough, you have COVID, which has actually brought to light that we really have serious gaps and serious challenges because we could not right away respond to the challenges that were brought by COVID-19. We saw in the energy sector demand having to go down of electricity. We saw because manufacturing industry had to close down. But we saw again the demand on the ICT side, that we were having challenges, or we are still having challenges to reach out to rural communities, the most vulnerable. So these are the challenges with or without COVID, and it's even going to be worse after COVID. So we need to put our act together as a region, as a continent, to come up with policies and strategies that would make sure that whenever we have disasters of this nature, pandemics of this nature, we are not caught. Caught off guard. We should be ready for any eventualities. So this is one of the lessons we are learning from COVID. We cannot even respond to the simple one that we are being asked to facilitate movement of essential goods and services across the regions. And we have seen bottlenecks at nodal points, our borders. And today we are even stigmatizing drivers that they are spreading the virus itself. So indeed, challenges are there, and therefore we need, like I said, we need to go back to the drawing board and see where we can bring enhancements or improvements to provide the necessary infrastructure that is required throughout the region and throughout the continent.
Now, I'll come back to you in a second, but I go to Tawela Nyirenda-Jerry at NEPAD. One of the great solutions that's always put up is public and private partnerships. I know the African Development Bank did a lot of work on this in the last few years, this idea of blending private and public money to take the risk out of infrastructure projects, which tend to be tricky and long-term. Surely, one thing I'll say to you, Tawela, is that that's going to be very difficult in a world where, as we just mentioned about COVID-19, where this economy alone is expected to contract by like 8.5% in the next year. There won't be that much private money around, surely.
So you're correct, Chris, in a way, in terms of the fact that with the shrinking economies and the fiscal space also shrinking, that it will be challenging, I think, in terms of how we finance these big projects. One thing that I want to mention, perhaps before I address your question directly, is to maybe highlight the fact that at the moment, AUD and NEPAD, working in collaboration with other partners, we are working on the next phase of Africa's regional and continental infrastructure priorities through the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA. And one of the things that PIDA is underpinning in this next phase is looking at integrated approaches to how we develop infrastructure. So looking at multi-sectoral approaches, but also looking at how we link infrastructure development very specifically to socioeconomic development. So what we are expecting to see in such an approach is that on the one hand, we're looking at issues of resilience and how we make our infrastructure more resilient, but also looking at how do we identify a pipeline of priority projects that already has looked at this issue of private sector engagement and the investability of these projects. So as these projects are being screened and selected, those are some of the things that are going into play in terms of making sure that the projects are resilient, that they have the potential to attract private capital, but that they also have a significant linkage to national and regional socioeconomic development. With COVID-19, we have also realized then that we will need to now think about how do we now mainstream health very strategically in the infrastructure projects to specifically address some of the issues that director from SADC was highlighting about, the movement of goods, people and services across borders. How do we make sure that our infrastructure actually is resilient and can withstand and support such movements? Now, regarding the issue of capital, yes, the fiscal space will contract, but we also see that perhaps this is an opportunity for those investors that have patient capital that can actually be invested in these projects to actually look at longer term gains as opposed to short term gains. So I think the strategy will be to see how do you actually balance that in terms of being able to attract that kind of capital. Now, within AUD and NEPAD, we are working very deliberately on the Africa Infrastructure Guarantee Mechanism as a way of also being able to mitigate some of the risk issues that arise from the investment in these large-scale infrastructure projects.
Well, if I can come back to Mapolo Mokoena in Gaborone there. Again, obviously NEPAD's making attempts here to try to balance the risk and try to attract more capital into infrastructure, something that the economy can't get enough of clearly in the future. But in terms of that, infrastructure projects, they're still very long term. They take a long time to get your returns back. Thirdly, they're also, they can have all kinds of problems in terms of tensions between the public and the private partner. Well, what are your hopes that this infrastructure gap can be filled?
Thank you once again, Chris. Indeed, we do have a number of mechanisms we are attempting to put in place in the region to try to address the infrastructure gap. Indeed, the issue of financing is key. In addition to making sure that we do have a robust bankable pipeline of bankable projects. One, we are working very hard on making sure that projects are prepared and they reach bankability stage. Bankability and ensuring that indeed once they reach bankability, you can invest in them. So we have put our own mechanism, the SADC Project Preparation and Development Facility, to do exactly that, to make sure that we do have a healthy pipeline of bankable projects. We are working closely with other project preparation facilities because, of course, resources are never enough. For instance, the NEPAD IPPF, we are working closely with AUDA NEPAD. We are working closely we have our own initiatives in the water sector. We have the Water Fund. We have one on climate resilient infrastructure development facility. So we do have quite a number of these facilities which ultimately will ensure that we do have a healthy pipeline of bankable projects. But in addition to that, the region is hard at work trying to operationalize our own SADC Regional Development Fund. We having challenges, it's taking long. However, we are hopeful that in the near future, this fund will be up and running. We are hopeful that once this fund is up and running, we should be able to attract more financing into, amongst others, infrastructure. Infrastructure is one of the windows of the Regional Development Fund, including industrialization and other windows. So we believe that a regional approach can help overcome constraints relating to absorptive capacity at the level of member states. And in order to ensure effective implementation and absorption, there's need to scale up capacity of implementing agencies alongside scaling up financial resources, and a regional approach would provide such opportunities. So we have recognized and observed a number of challenges that have to do with preparation, development, and implementation of infrastructure. So we're looking at also a number of innovative ways of funding infrastructure and regional integration. Not so long ago, the region adopted its own domestic resource mobilization strategy. And we are looking at a number of avenues to finance, including levies on import and export duties, illicit financial flows, recall to the regional lotteries and events, amongst others. So we do have a couple of these measures that we are looking into as a region, and indeed private sector participation. So in a nutshell, these are the measures and frameworks that we are looking at and we are implementing.
Tawela, in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area, I say very exciting, but it's a massive challenge for the already difficult job of getting enough infrastructure to keep this continent doing business and turning over.
So I think the Continental Free Trade Area, as you rightly said, is an important aspect and an important element of Africa's future and prosperity. And I think that we can all agree that infrastructure also is a very significant part of that, because infrastructure is what is going to help to actually drive and help in terms of the intra-African trade, but also the trade between Africa and other regions. I think what is important from the perspective of the CFTA is to really underscore how the different classes of infrastructure will help in terms of industrialization, which then touches upon issues such as the access to energy and energy security, the issues of ICT and digitalization, and how that also contributes to trade. And I think that, to realize the CFTA and to bring in the infrastructure element, I think it is served best, I think, by this whole idea of looking at things a little bit more holistically, but also underscoring the importance then of cross-border infrastructure and regional infrastructure. So when we start talking about trade corridors and the infrastructure that supports those trade corridors, it becomes important for us to then look at those trade corridors end to end, but also looking at the different aspects of infrastructure across those corridors. So whether we're talking about water and sanitation, whether we're talking about ICT and digitalization, the issue of energy, issue of transport and multimodal transport, all those become important elements of how Africa is going to realize prosperity and enable trade and free flows of people, goods and services across the continent.
If I can go to Mapolo Mokoena in Gaborone, I mean, it's already going to contribute to a massive infrastructure bill, which the continent's trying to fill, in the fact you're going to need, I mean, we're talking about a passport, an African passport for everybody. I mean, that's going to take incredible infrastructure and border posts alone so that you can pass through with your chip and you can move around and do business. How do you think that kind of money can be got together?
Thank you very much, Chris. On the issue of the passport, I would like my sister to come in on that one to indicate progress we have made in that regard. But on the facilitation part for cross-border movement across the region and the continent, in supporting the Continental Free Trade Area, there are certain programs and projects that we are fully behind, or we are rallying behind as a region. For instance, and these are part of Agenda 2063, the issue of high-speed rail. My sister mentioned the issue of connectivity, interoperability. So that's one of the projects which is on our cards, the high-speed rail across the continent. We have made a lot of progress in that regard. We have identified those priority and pilot projects, and we should be seeing a lot of progress on the ground in the near future. The other project or program that we are also supporting and rallying behind is a single African air transport market. This is in recognition that for a very long time, we have been wishing to open up our skies. And now we have come up with this concept of a single African air transport market. a number of countries so far. I think we have 34 member states who have signed up to that declaration for the project to go ahead. And we are hopeful that opening up the skies will also address the challenges we are facing when it comes to market integration and trade. And the other one is improvements on the Trans-Africa Highway, which now passes or traverses a number of critical corridors in the region to ensure that there is smooth transportation of goods and services across the continent, as well as the SADC region. The issue of smart corridors, we believe that that's one concept that has to be fast-tracked.
Bearing in mind, time is of the essence. We had the new Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area on this very channel just a few weeks ago, and he was saying July the 1st, they're still hoping to launch despite everything that's been happening in the last few months. How likely is it, you think, this kind of massive infrastructure program can be kick-started to meet the challenge?
So I think that maybe, Chris, it's always, I think, important for us to acknowledge our successes and acknowledge the fact that we're not starting from zero. So we've had the first phase of the program for infrastructure development in Africa, which is the continental priorities as set forth by our heads of states and also informed by the regional economic communities, and we're now going into the second phase. So it's not like we are starting from zero. We have a base to build on, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and to acknowledge the fact that there are certain lessons that have been learned, and that going forward, the idea then is to see how do we actually accelerate and use what we have learned to move forward. In terms of addressing some of the issues that Director Mokoena raised, I think it's important to also maybe mention the fact that a lot of the things that will support the CFTA, much as we're talking about hard infrastructure, we also have to look at the soft infrastructure aspect. So the issues of the policy, legal, and regulatory frameworks that will enable some of these things to happen. So when we talk about the movement of people across borders, if it's our land borders, and we're looking at our one-stop border posts and how to make those more efficient. On the one hand, it is about the physical infrastructure, but it is also very much about the software aspects of how we mainstream and harmonize the policy, legal, and regulatory elements as well.
So, and in terms of connectivity as well, if I could go back to you, Mama Mokoena, in Gaborone. I mean, basically, the other day on this very channel, one of the guests I was interviewing said that connectivity should be like meat and drink to the economies of Africa. If they want to grow, they need to have plenty of it. But as you know, even with the connectivity we have today, we're not quite sure whether it's going to hold out sometime. How do you think we can get the investment together to from private and public sources to make connectivity be taken for granted?
Each time we raise these issues, we go back to saying financing of infrastructure. It is clear that access to adequate infrastructure has a bearing on livelihoods and overall economic output. And financing, it's our main challenge, I believe. And therefore, we need to have concerted efforts as member states in SADC and in the continent to make sure that we address this issue. I mentioned the efforts that we are putting in place to make sure that this financing or this challenge is addressed. And indeed, all our efforts should be geared towards that. Member states can no longer afford to finance these huge infrastructure projects. And the traditional ways that we know, also they are also having some challenges. And therefore, we need to bring on board, we have to be bold enough and bring on board our private sector. But of course, there are certain things that we need to do. The enabling environment, our policy space, our regulatory space, and all those, I think there's a lot that we still need to do so that they can be confidence, or they can bring confidence to the private sector to put in the necessary resources to support member states. So we really need to work hard to make sure that the private sector is fully on board. I also talked about innovative ways of financing infrastructure. Time and again, we talk about domestic resources. We still have pension funds, for instance, which are untapped. And I believe this is the time. This is the time more than ever before that we really need to getting serious about tapping some of these resources to finance our own infrastructure.
How strong a case are you going to put to private business? I mean, bearing in mind that in some ways it's as much in their interests to get connectivity and more trade and more business across the continent as it is for the governments of the people who live here.
So within AED and FED, as part of our implementation model, we have two key initiatives that are very geared towards private sector participation. So we have the Continental Business Network, which is a platform that allows us to better engage with private sector in terms of understanding their needs, but also being able to present them with projects and addressing some of the concerns that they have about investing in some of these infrastructure projects. At the same time, and I think responding to what the director was talking about in terms of the pension funds, we have the 5% agenda, which looks at how do we actually raise the financing that is directed by pension funds towards infrastructure projects to at least 5% of their assets under management. I think it's fair to say that even though we always say that the problem is financing, it's not so much that the money is not there, but perhaps it is how do we actually tap into those funds and the monies that exist and make our projects bankable, attractive enough to the private sector for them to actually put money into. And I think that's going to be one of the things that coming out of COVID-19 that we're going to have to look very carefully at to say, how do we actually make sure that we're able to tap into these funds and these resources out there. I think it's also important to, as we talk about private sector, a lot of times when we talk about private sector, we're talking about what I would call, for lack of a better word, big private sector. But I think it's important also for us to look at the domestic market, to look at our local private sector, look at our SMEs. How do we involve our SMEs in these infrastructure projects and give them access to these infrastructure projects? Unemployment, I think, is a big problem right now, and we're seeing that it's going to probably get worse before it gets better. And the question is, how are we going to use infrastructure development to address the issue of unemployment and give our young people access to opportunities that would arise from these infrastructure projects?
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Tawela Nyirenda-Jere, the Head of Economic Integration at the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and Mapolao Mokoena, the Director of Infrastructure at the South African Development Community, coming to us there from Gaborone. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this edition of Building Africa's Prosperity. From me, Chris Bishop, and the team, it's goodbye.